All right, well, thank you everyone. Welcome to the final session of CFSA's 36th Sustainable Agriculture Conference. This is the keynote panel, Missing Pieces in the Movement for Ethical Meat. My name is Mary Beth Miller, CFSA's Education Coordinator, and I am honored to be sharing a Zoom room with all of you and all of these people, all of our panelists here today who work on the front lines of environmental justice, food sovereignty, and worker rights when it comes to meat production and processing. Before we get started, I want to thank our session sponsor, First Hand Foods. So please check them out at the trade show or get in touch with them if you want to learn more about them. So some housekeeping, please remain muted throughout the presentation. If you have any questions or comments, please put them in the chat. We will do questions at the end of the session. Please remember our conference community agreements when you engage in any discussion or dialogue. So I would like to introduce our panelists. Our panel moderator is Meredith Lee. She is a teacher, a writer, consultant, and an activist. She is the author of Pure Charcuterie and the Ethical Meat Handbook. I think award-winning Ethical Meat Handbook as of recently, so congratulations. And Meredith has put together this panel and the discussion for us today. We also have Ilana Dubester. Okay, I practiced that. Not sure if I got that right. But she's the founder and executive director of the Hispanic Liaison, which is an advocacy and direct services organization that was founded in 1995 to address the needs of the growing Latinx community in Chatham and surrounding counties. We also are joined by Naima Mohammed, who is the organizing co-director with the North Carolina Environmental Justice Network. Whose mission is to promote health and environmental quality for all people of North Carolina through community action for clean industry, safe workplaces, and fair access to all human and natural resources. And we are also joined by Pork Rind, the pork evangelist. He can tell you more about his work, but he also has a booth at the trade show. So please go find that before you leave. Go check out more of his work at the trade show here in the conference. So I am going to stop talking and hand it over to Meredith. Again, if you're just now joining us, please put your questions in the chat and we will address those at the end of the session. Thanks so much.
Thank you, Mary Beth. Hello, everyone. Good morning. Thank you for being here. I want to give each of our panelists a little bit more time to introduce themselves and say, kind of get to the crux of what their work is in the world. So I will maybe call on you, Ilana, to begin and give us a little bit more detail.
Certainly. Thank you so much. And it's a pleasure to be with all of you this morning. Buenos dias on a beautiful, chilly Sunday morning in North Carolina. So let's see, the Hispanic Liaison or Vínculo Hispano, was said, we're 26 years old. We are based in Siler City, and this year opened a new office in Sanford. We covered the rural central Piedmont. Our primary counties are Chatham, Alamance, Randolph, and Lee. And we are a small organization, about 9 staff members, but we're also very mighty. And so our primary focus is in advocacy work, but also do a lot of direct services to community members, new immigrants and long-timers, and civic engagement, leadership development with youth and adults. During the COVID crisis, which we're still in, obviously, but at the start of the COVID crisis, even though health is not one of our primary focus, this was such a tremendous crisis in the community, way beyond health concerns, that we pivoted our efforts to address the crisis in our community, both its health impact as well as it relates to workers' rights impact. There is a large meat processing plant, chicken processing plant in Siler City and a few in Sanford, and called Mount Air Farms that I'm going to be talking about in a bit. And we were getting dozens of calls from workers from Mount Air concerned about what was happening in the plant as regards to safety and COVID. And so aside from the workers' rights piece, we also have worked on access to COVID vaccine and testing, and have been doing a lot of different community education outreach regarding COVID as well. So I'll stop there.
Thank you, Ilana, for your work and your intro. Ryan, you want to tell us a little bit more about what pork evangelism entails?
Sorry, when you say it out loud like that, it sounds goofy.
Not my intention.
So yeah, I'll introduce myself. My name is Ryan. People call me Pork Ryan, and I'm hearing some echo. That's weird.
I think the iPad needs to mute.
Marcia's iPad. Ah, there we go. Beautiful. Perfect. All right. Anyways, my name is Ryan. People call me Pork Ryan. I do a lot of agricultural education, both in the States as well as overseas in East Africa in countries like Uganda and Tanzania. And really grateful to be here. A lot of my experience is in regenerative, organic agricultural practices, primarily in livestock production. I didn't grow up with a farming background. I was that kid who just liked playing in the dirt and being in nature. But going to a land-grant university, I realized that I had an affinity for nature, but also had an affinity for agriculture. However, as most of you know, the environmentalists and the agriculturalists tend to not get along. And so I had a midlife crisis at 22 in terms of what I was going to do with my career in animal science. And I realized that I need to go farm and I need to go make a livelihood out of that. And from that experience, I've been able to raise every edible livestock. However, pigs are my passion. And they've really showed me just how beautiful culture is, how beautiful people are, people who are raising pigs, not just in the States, but also overseas. And so I do a lot of swine advocacy. I do a lot of pork education. And I've been able to do that working with both environmental organizations and agricultural organizations, both for-profit and nonprofit. Currently, I do a lot of grant writing and grant reviewing, as well as private consultations. And let me tell you, I've enjoyed it a lot. And so really grateful to be here and share my experiences as not just as a farmer, but as a founder of a food council in my region, as someone who's worked on a state, national, international level with agricultural development, especially when it comes to niche livestock production. So other than that, I'll pass on to Naima and let her speak. Thanks.
Okay, excuse me for a minute. All right, my computer's a little bit lagging behind me this morning. So, good morning, everybody, and I'm glad to be here with you. Again, my name is Naima Muhammad. I'm the organizing director with the North Carolina Environmental Justice Network. And as in that role, I've worked with communities over the last 3 decades that's living with the industrial hog operations. And we've been in that capacity addressing the environmental and health impacts that people are experiencing living near those animals. And we've done research that's documented the health impacts for people. So because they felt they needed to prove what was happening to them, because the state, our legislators were saying that people were lying. The industry was telling the legislators that people was making this stuff up because the waste that was generated from those animals did not leave the site that it was produced on. And, amazingly, they believed it. And what was always amazing to me is that, everybody in the world know that air and water does not stand still, and we are not gonna, man can't control it. And so to say that this animal waste, once you irrigate it, doesn't leave the site that it was created on, it's just, unbelievable that our legislators would fall for that. At any rate, the community members have been, you know, experiencing ill health as a result of living near these animals. We document a lot of elevated blood pressure, a lot of stress, respiratory symptoms, high rates of asthma in children living within a 5 mile radius of the animals versus children living beyond that 5 mile marker. Um, uh, a lot of people with nausea, headaches, burning eyes, running noses, and gagging and actually throwing up when they come outside because of the odors in the air. And that people have been forced to not be able to use their clotheslines to hang their clothes because when they do, the odor gets in the clothes and then they have to redo their laundry. They don't really sit outside the way they used to. And in all the years that I've been going into these communities, you don't really see children outside playing. And most people know that folks live in rural America because they love the outdoors. And so to have those things stripped from you is just really depressing for people. So we found a lot of depression and anger in amongst people living in these communities from having to live like that. Their property is being devalued, their health is being deteriorated, and just life of as it was known for them in rural America has completely changed with the coming of industrialized agriculture. And so I'll stop there and I don't know if there's anybody else I should pass to.
I think you were the one, and
Last
I'll take
one.
it back, Naima. Thank you.
Okay,
Thanks to all
thank you.
three of you for just giving us a little slice of the deep and important work that you're doing. I think it's pretty clear we have a powerhouse panel today. I'll tell a little bit more about myself. I'm a former farmer, former butcher shop owner who has pretty much just dedicated myself to running my mouth as much as possible about decentralized, non-coercive food systems. And I make it my point to examine food systems through the lens of the meat system because it is probably one of the most systemically challenging, most challenging from the point of view of the systems work. And so I feel the need before we dive deeper to sort of name the goal of this panel. We are here, Naima, Ilana, myself, and Ryan, here to name and talk about with you the systemic nature of the problems of industrial meat and air the complex realities that result from that in a way that invites listeners to expand their thinking about the condition, the aim, and even the rhetoric of the sustainable, regenerative, or niche meat movement as a vehicle for substantive community support, both right now and the future. And I think it's really important to state the goal because it involves acknowledging our connection to the system that we're working to subvert. It is not about talking about a system that is separate from the work of sustainable agriculture. And so I want to thank CFSA for making space for this conversation and to our panelists for taking the time to touch upon the topics. Please mute yourselves. It creates an echo when you don't. Thank you. I do want to also acknowledge this is the last session of the event, and we have a deeply important and very complex topic full of hard truths to visit upon. And it probably won't all be tidy, entirely actionable, or comfortable. On top of that, we're meeting virtually, which sometimes adds to the difficulty that human beings have in recognizing everything that's going on in the brain and body. And when we touch upon discomfort, we have a hard time making meaning of it right away. And so as I remind myself out loud to breathe and make space for a deep kind of listening and invitation, maybe it'll be a helpful reminder to you as well, that discomfort and unsolved thoughts or feelings are just that, an invitation to recognize powerful meaning. My goal today is to listen and inquire, now, and then commit to the ongoing work of sorting it in my mind and body later. So that being said, I'm deeply honored to be here in the presence and knowledge of my fellow panelists and to be here and now for this important conversation we're about to have. Our goal is to explore 4 questions for about 15 minutes each and then have time for some audience questions that have turned up in the chat during the conversation. So I'm going to start by spotlighting COVID, which might seem convenient, but I think it is a space that we can all reflect from together at the very least. I know within the sustainable ag conversation, and of course other conversations as well, COVID has been a really relatable example that we have gone to spotlight a system-wide shock that showed people the reality and the relative fragility of the industrial meat system and made it apparent to more eaters, I think, than were aware of it before COVID. But I think simultaneously, it also turned everyone's eyes toward local and regional food systems as alternatives and thereby exposed their strengths and weaknesses as well. So I would really like to spring from that consideration and ask our panelists to reflect for us on COVID as a shock to the supply chain. And while it was really seen and felt by a lot of eaters, I would love for our panelists to speak to the realities of the communities with which they work, both inside of a crisis like COVID and outside of such an event. I would love to hear how were the realities of the communities with which you work altered by COVID, and how were they maybe not so different? I'd love to start with Ryan, if you're willing to jump right in here and hit upon this question for us.
Yeah, sure. And I'm going to limit myself to 5 minutes, so get a timer out because I love to talk. All right. So for me, I used to actually work with Lowe's Foods, and during COVID-19, and I remember all those shelves going empty. Meat. Sometimes they'd be like, "All right, we got to do sales for our meat, for our brisket, for our steaks." Man, you couldn't find anything out there. And it was really scary to see how people were desperately looking for meat protein during that time. And so, personally for me, I see how a lot of times you just have hope that something's going to be there and you take it for granted. And then the plague happens, and then what you find most readily available no longer is. I have some friends who are in the commercial livestock industry who are selling to national, global markets, and their problem was not that they didn't have animals. Their problem was the processing, and their issue was we got too many animals. Now our animals are need to either be euthanized, or we're going to have to figure out some kind of way of us being able to actually slow their growth. Because if we're going to be feeding these animals, feed is expensive. If you raise any livestock, you will know it is expensive to feed animals, especially when it comes to monogastrics like pigs and poultry, chickens, turkeys, etc. And so it was hard for a lot of my commercial friends, for my niche friends who I love. It was a different experience. Those who didn't have a website suffered because they didn't have a website. Those who did the due diligence of treating their farm like a business and actually preparing, not necessarily for a crisis, but just good common business sense in terms of having a website, being searchable on Google. I got some people who are raising pigs. They they increased their profit margins by 500%. Some of them 800% during COVID-19 because shortage of meat. People were looking for alternative sources, more secure sources of meat. And so it's really interesting to see kind of the fragility on the commercial land. The farmers who have the product can't even actually get the product to market versus a lot of our niche scale producers who made more money than they've ever made in their entire farming career during that season. Now, the issue that we're having now, as I sit on the advisory board for the Niche Meat Processors Assistance Network, is we're seeing that processing, even on a niche scale, is on the back hold. So a lot of farmers are having to deal with that. we're talking waiting lists from a year to 2.5 years to prepare for that. So that's really stressful for a lot of my farming friends and people that I advocate for, is figure out ways of how do we cope with longer periods or wait periods for processing. How can we make a farm business and have those plans for our farm and profitability if the wait time is 2 years before I can process an animal? Also, if you're at a very small scale, you don't have that advantage of being able to do bulk processing, which a lot of the bigger processors don't want to deal with people who have only 5 pigs or 1 cattle. They want people who can bring 50 hogs at one time or 15 head of steer at one time. So those have been some really challenges for a lot of people. Some of them have considered doing their own processing. Some of them have thought about being creative about how they do processing and how they market their animals, doing wholes and halves and stuff like that. So those have been the challenges and I guess alterations that I've seen with my farming community. And yeah, hopefully that was insightful. I will yield the floor to the next speaker. Thanks.
Thank you. I think that's really important too, because what we're interested in is like a whole system conversation. And so, you know, I feel like this community of sustainable ag folks has done a lot of work in production, you know, setting up systems of production. But what you're naming, Ryan, is that there are lots of still bottlenecks that existed before COVID, but were amplified by COVID in the processing sector. And so really thinking about the system implications of that as we attempt to grow a more fair, less coercive meat system. And I think that's a perfect segue to hearing from Ilana about meat processing plant workers and what the realities were before and after COVID for that population. You're muted.
Of course, the famous word of the 2020s. Sorry about that. So for folks in the meat processing and also in the farm industry, COVID helped to shed more light into the dark corners of the meat processing industry and in its treatment of employees and contractors, its lack of transparency in a public health crisis, and also its lack of accountability to everybody. So in addition to that, COVID exposed a vacuum in leadership and the authority of local state agencies to regulate, to impose rules, to monitor worker safety as it relates to a public health crisis. So essential workers in the meat and farms didn't have the option of working from home. And most of these workers are immigrants or people of color, and who also have less access to health insurance. And on top of that, their working conditions increase their risk for COVID. These are folks in meat processing industries are working shoulder to shoulder. These plants have no windows. They blow either hot air or cold air at high force that spreads COVID even beyond the 6 feet. And the industries are set up so no worker is working that far from each other. And they are constantly exposed to harsh chemicals through the air and water in these plants, which make the health hazard, that make COVID even more of a health hazard for them, the consequences of contracting COVID. So although these were considered essential workers, they were essentially treated as expendable workers by the industry and by the state and federal authorities, who refused to impose protections for essential workers. So in Siler City, as the example the one that I'm closest to, Montague Farms chicken processing plant has about 1,800 workers. Some are worked for the company directly, but many of them work through contractors or temp agencies, so to speak. And these temporary workers are paid less and receive less benefits than the company employees, and contractors don't have access to health insurance. And a majority of the workers that we are in contact with are contract workers for the company and not employees of the company. And so back in, I'm going to summarize because otherwise, Jesus, I have a lot to say about this. So in the early days of the pandemic, we started sounding the alarm of monetary firms and other processing plants being a ticking time bomb for COVID, and sounding the alarm locally and at the state level. And basically, at first was just no reaction to our sounding the alarm that this was going to happen. And then of course the outbreaks began that were inevitable. And we were told by all of them, local health, county, state health, Department of Labor, Department of Human Services, Department of Commerce, nobody had authority over this. Nobody had a way to impose rules and regulations. Nobody could go and inspect. All they could do is make recommendations to employers, and hopefully the employers would abide. And some employers did a good job of protecting workers, and many did not do a good job of protecting workers, which led to them being the culprit of community spread in a tremendous way. Last summer, 50% of COVID cases were in the Latinx community across the state, even though we're only 10% of the population. And a lot of this had to do with essential workers and farm workers. Also, another impediment we ran into and still do is that the health authorities refuse to share information about COVID outbreaks in specific plants. So we can never know if what the safety protocols that they have in place are working or not working. And so that's a very big deal. Also, the fact that companies that had 500 more employees were not required to provide COVID sick leave. So some companies did offer out of their own, actually it would be better for them, but anyway, and other companies didn't. So then we have workers that live paycheck to paycheck that can't afford to miss a day of work, who would be showing up to work sick. Obviously not so sick that they couldn't work, right? But then perpetuating the spread of COVID because they couldn't take sick leave, because they couldn't afford to take sick leave. So that was another issue we ran across with workers. And one thing that came out of it that I'm hope is going to have a long-term positive consequence is that because of the inaction of the state and the governor who was going to issue an executive order that never came about to protect essential workers, we joined forces with 5 other organizations and 3 law firms to sue the Department of Labor for not protecting essential workers. So that lawsuit, well, it's not exactly a lawsuit, it's a legal action. We started last October 2020. And this August, the judge ruled in our favor, which means that now the Department of Labor is going to have guidelines for employers to protect workers from COVID. And we're also working on this being a baseline for future and possible pandemics and epidemics even. So that's one good thing that has come out, is that hopefully there'll be no longer a vacuum of authority over employers about COVID.
Wow. That's so much. Thank you for sharing that, and thank you for the work that you've done in collaboration. I think that what really resonates for me in that is that this is not isolated to COVID. I mean, we're recently hearing about the chemical exposure that has come out of the plants. That's like, it's not even COVID related. So it's very clear that these workers are on an ongoing basis, vulnerable to this lack of accountability, this lack of action, and the ability of the industry to sort of invisibilize what's happening. And I think that is also very true for the folks that Naima is working on behalf of. And so, Naima, I would love to invite you to tell us a little bit about how COVID did or did not impact or change the realities of the folks that you advocate for.
Okay. Well, it did change. And I just want to say to Ilana, we were doing some work with the meat packers and heard all of the stories that you just talked about. The fact that they were being highly impacted by COVID, not being made aware when someone around them got sick because of the Privacy Act that everybody hide behind on everything in this country. And, so, but in the communities, the reports that I've been getting, the first thing is that because of COVID, one of the most important things for a community in this fight for justice is to be able to coalesce with one another, to be able to, gather in numbers and strategize on how to address issues and concerns that they have. And COVID shut that down completely. And so, one of the concerns that I've been thinking about even more so now is, when everything open back up, these communities are going to be in a lag behind what's happening to them, because they're going to be trying to play catch up on, how to address and strategize around the things that they are living with. But there's been a lot of illnesses and deaths in the communities. It's almost like every day somebody was calling me and said, Naima, so and so just died, and or somebody just got sick, and that it's a lot of illnesses in our communities. So the reports have been constantly coming in that people are ill and dying, and they just said we ain't never seen so much death. This is in particular in the there are several counties in North Carolina that's some of the top counties for hog production in this country. Duplin and Sampson County being number one and two. And then we have Pender and Robeson counties. And so in those communities in particular, we've been getting tremendous phone calls and reports of people being ill and dying. And it just breaks my heart because of COVID, people not being able to even go and attend to somebody that just lost a person. And in the black community, it's a part of how we grieve is to be able to hold a massive funeral, everybody coming in, people comment gather and then do a repast and sit and talk with the family, spend time with them. And so those things not happening because of COVID. I'm just saying that when we come out of COVID, there's going to be a lot of mental stuff that's going to have to be addressed. And, we need to be getting ready for that as well because of again, because of the inability of people to be able to take care of one another and go and see about each other, support one another in a time of death and illnesses. And so that's going to be crushing. And these things don't just disappear. Those kinds of feelings don't just disappear. So I have a great concern for that. But the other part of the problem is that while COVID has been going on, these industries have not stopped their behavior. So they are still impacting people in a way that they're unable to address in the fashion that they were used to because of COVID. So people are being, you know, um, exposed and set up for industries to come into their communities to set up shop that's going to tremendously exacerbate the environmental harms that they've already suffered, the health conditions that already exist are going to be made, we always say threefold at this point because they trying to take this waste, this animal waste, and turn it into biogas. And we see that as a false solution because it does not do anything to give communities relief that's been living with these animals all these decades. And so that's a real concern for us in terms of what's going to happen to the people in these communities. Where they going to be running these pipelines and they're going to be crossing people's property, and then they're going to have the right for eminent domain if they choose to use that, so that means people gonna experience even further loss. So these are the things that we foresee and are working to address in a time of a separation in this country because of the COVID, and so it makes it quite stressful on people to try to figure out what's going to happen to me I see this huge plant being built across the street from me. What does this mean, and what can I do about it? So that's just those are the kinds of things that we're having to deal with right now. And then we're dealing with again a state government and a regulatory agency that's really hog tied to these industries, and so they give corporations whatever it is they want over the protection of the people that they supposed to be representing and taking care of in the state.
Absolutely. I think, the thread that is like dominant in all of these answers is that I think to spotlight at this point is how this is part of system design. I mean, ignoring the necessities of grieving together, and visibilizing people's actual experiences to where you are only in a nominal way responding to the public's knowledge of an animal waste problem, but ignoring the actual human rights implications of an animal waste problem. And so I'm curious because of each of your deep work in these situations and communities, what are some ways that we can talk to listeners about the aspects of the way the system is designed that allow these realities to be reproduced over and over again, right? So if we're able to acknowledge that COVID wasn't like something that created new realities, but just amplified all the realities that were already there, how can we, and we don't have a ton of time, obviously we could talk about this for days and days, but what are some system designs that you can pluck out that you see over and over again to help our listeners understand the systemic nature of these issues? And anyone can start. I don't want to have to call on, just speak out.
I'm happy to start. So to mention just a few, right? Because the list is long. So one of the things that perpetuates the systems of oppression, this unsustainable model that we have, is the lack of strong labor laws to protect workers, right? And in our right to work state that really prevents and suppresses the right of workers from joining unions. Out of the 200 plus meat processing plants in North Carolina, only one is unionized, Smithfield in Tar Heel, which is the largest pork producer. It took them easily 10 years to get to that point, 10 years of a fight to get to a union. And recently some union organizers came to Siler City to try and distribute flyers outside of the parking lot of Mount Air Farms. And within a week, they had sheriff deputies stationed outside of the parking lot and who were there pretty much 24/7. So these kind of tactics, right, to intimidate workers. And so farm workers in North Carolina managed to form a union through the Farm Labor Organizing Community, but now North Carolina passed a law that they can't collect their dues from their paychecks, right? And so this is all part of the high cost of cheap produce or cheap meat. Another thing in terms of systems, as we think about treaties with other countries, is, for example, NAFTA. NAFTA put 1 million farmers out of business in Mexico, which led to a migration surge to the United States in the mid-90s. Although the migration had started earlier in the 90s, and the meat processing industry in North Carolina was the gateway industry to bring workers from Mexico and other places in Latin America. They were at that time placing billboards south of the border, encouraging people to come, even billboards about Siler City of all places, come to work in the poultry industry in Siler City. And many of our community members told us about these billboards. And they were also paying recruiters who then provided bus transportation for people to come to small towns all over rural North Carolina. And so these are, the companies didn't care how workers got here or if they had the proper permits, right? So many don't have the proper permits to work, which make them a very pliable workforce and a fearful workforce. They are afraid to organize. They are afraid to speak up for their rights because they don't have what we call papers. And so fear of deportation is a big driver in suppressing workers' voices, which is also a huge deal. And a lot of these plants, I think, is worth mentioning, as we know, they're located in small towns, in rural communities. Many of them, most of them, lack a local advocacy organization that works for workers' rights. And so there isn't like a local recourse for workers to seek help and organize together. And even for those that, and then these companies also like own these places, right? They are often one of the largest employers and taxpayers and pays the water bill. And so local officials are ¿cómo se dice? Forgot my words. Are really bound by these companies, right? And feel like they take precedence over anybody else, right? And so local advocacy organizations like ours that poke the beast face retaliation locally, and not every organization is willing to do that. And I understand why, because it takes a lot of building up to the point that you can even poke the beast and not get totally burned by it, right? So those are some of the difficulties in system inequalities I'm going to point out. Sorry, I went on a little bit too long, and I have more to say. Oh.
Yeah, thank you. Porkron or Naima, do you have anything to add to this?
I do.
Yes.
But I'll let Naima
go
go
ahead.
first.
No, you go ahead.
No, ladies first. Go ahead.
Oh.
Go ahead now.
Okay, so yeah, I know as we look in the communities, one of the things that we work with the workers at the Smithfield plant when they were trying to become a unionized body, and we witnessed the force and I'm saying force and the abuse by Smithfield of those workers during that. It was like a 12-year campaign to get a union in there. But they would follow workers home, and they was beating up the union organizers from the United Food and Commercial Workers Union. They had organizers at that plant, and they got beat up by the employees of Smithfield. They in Smithfield hired their own internal police force to police people, and so they were following workers home to make sure they weren't going to union meetings and stuff. And then they opened their own medical facility right across the street. So, because in these jobs, workers were reporting high rates of injuries, and they were being sent over to the company medical facility, patched up, and sent right back to work, no matter, and which caused further harm to workers. Um, in the communities, people were part of the concern is that what happens to people in the community. You have a lot of the migrant immigrants that come in, and they are living in housing owned by these contract growers, and so they are controlling them in that manner. I remember going to a community meeting, and one of the um, migrant workers was there, and he was saying he had 30 days. They was putting him out because they caught him coming to one of our meetings, and so they were trying to uh, uh, what you call it when you putting somebody out of the house, and my mind went blank. But okay,
Eviction.
evict him, evict. They was trying to evict him, and he was concerned about what was going to happen to him and his family. Where were they going to go? And so people in the meeting were trying to help him figure out what to do and what could we do as a community to rally around him and help him in that situation. But that's a lot of what the people in the community and the workers are threatened. If you speak up in the community, then you get a visit from somebody in the industry. I remember being at a what NCJN. We hold these quarterly meetings where we bring communities together to conversate and strategize around issues and how do we address them and what's the best way forward and how do we do it together. And we were having a meeting, and the port council had posted the meeting and encouraged the contract growers to come to the meeting. And so when they showed up, of course, they came in their driving trucks with those rubber flags and rifle guns on the back, which is an intimidation in itself. And they pulled up on the grounds, and then they just gonna come and try to bogart their way in. We was like, no, you're not welcome in this meeting. They said, well, it's a public meeting. Yes, it is, but it's not public to you, and you're not welcome in the meeting. And then I got home that night, and I started getting phone calls saying, telling me about if I kept doing what I was doing, I wouldn't be able to eat and this sort of stuff. And they said, well, do you like to eat? And do you have to feed your family? I said, well, first of all, you don't know. And so I just,
the one that was yummy.
Please mute yourselves to the listeners. We're hearing somebody's voice other than Naima's right now.
and so I was getting these phone calls, like threatening phone calls. And so I just said to them, I said, well, look, I don't know who y'all used to dealing with, but you don't scare me, so don't call my damn phone no more. And I left it like that. And but for the community people, that kind of intimidation shuts people down. They become fearful to speak up, to come out to meetings, or to just even be seen talking to you. I know when I first started meeting with communities, they used to ask me all the time, Naima, you not scared? You got to travel home by yourself. Don't you want to spend the night? I was like, no, I'm going home. I said, I got a rule. If you if you jump out at this car, you're gonna have one of two choices. You can be drugged or you can be hit. It'll be up to you because I'm not stopping. And I'm running red lights and stop signs, so y'all just be on the lookout. And so I was like, but I'm not afraid. I'm gonna do what I have to do. And that's what they count on. They count on us being afraid. And when you be afraid and shut down, they gonna really come after you even more. The more public you are, the safer you are. Is how I feel about it. So, but anyway, I don't know if I answered the questions. So I'm gonna just be quiet and go to Port. My friend Port Ryan, who I intend to stay in touch with.
Yeah, I got your direct message, and I took a photo of it, so I'm like, yeah, we're gonna talk. But
I
yeah,
look forward to it.
good. If I had anything to add, it just from I guess, producer's experience, both from my beloved niche group, and then kind of looking at the commercial aspect. The issue with the systems that we have for local meat is there ain't no infrastructure. There's like barely any infrastructure for it. And by infrastructure, I do mean processing. I do mean distribution, logistics. It can be extraordinarily challenging to make a profit off of locally raised meat at a scalable level. And we got some folks, some producers on here. I see my buddy Ben Grimes. You know what I'm talking about. Where it is hard to make that scale where you're growing kind of beyond being a homesteader, beyond being, oh, this is just for me and my family, into actually feeding whole communities. Again, like I mentioned earlier, processing is a huge issue. Me and fellow board advisors for NC Choices, which I sit as a board advisor for, we've worked with local legislature, the state, to actually get funding during COVID-19 for your small scale processors and producers. So they actually had money to expand, scale up the processing facilities, so that way they could have more people, more farmers being intaked for processing. So that's one thing that we've been working on in the state of North Carolina to kind of figure out. It is becoming more of a national trend of people who are interested in processing and wanting to scale out their processing facilities now that there is more of a demand. The issue with that from a processor side is that processors have an issue with farmers who, couple issues, farmers come in without, with too few animals than what they said, or too many animals than what they had initially agreed to, come in late for processing, don't pick up their meat on time. These are issues that processors are having. Other additional things is, especially during COVID-19 and the way unemployment is, which don't blame anybody, is that processors don't have enough people working nowadays. A lot of people just said, hey, I can get unemployment, that's great. And so a lot of processors, even the state of North Carolina, are experiencing labor shortages because of that. So that's been a big issue for them, just being able to keep the status quo with their operations. So that's small scale producers. Now we take it over to commercials. The system that we often see is vertical integration. So a farmer has a simple not simple, very convoluted contract with a big company. It might be Smithfield, might be JBS, might be Cargill. And so those animals may or may not be owned by that farmer. The farmer is really just a tender, or a helper, a raiser, not necessarily the actual owner of those livestock. So then those livestock get, from weaning all the way up to, finished weight. They go on a truck owned by the company. That truck goes to the processing facility owned by the company. That probably get the meat all cut up, packaged up, gets distributed by that processor. So it's all integrated. And that's the beauty of efficiency that I've been trying to educate and impart on, local scale producers, because there is something to learn from commercial operations and commercial producers. That's part of the reason why, despite all of my farming experience being in regenerative livestock management, I still ended up working and doing partnerships with people like the National Pork Board and NC Pork Council, because I knew there was information, knowledge, operations of efficiency and scale that I wanted to bring down on the local level. Now, the issue with that is it's all vertically integrated and it's all consolidated. So when something goes wrong, it goes horribly wrong, as we've seen with COVID-19. So I think that's the fragility of the commercial aspect, as well as the fragility in the local meat processing and local meat raising aspect as well. They're both, like, local meat's not necessarily solving all the problems we have our own problems in that as well. It's not the savior of the world. It is just one option and one solution in a massive problem when it comes to how do we acquire meat, especially ethically raised meat, on a local, state, national, maybe even international level. And with that, I'll pass back to Meredith. Thanks.
I think Ilana wants to add something.
Yeah, no, thanks, Rand. That was excellent. Yeah, I think, and part of that, as I think about your comments, is, the incredible unfair competition between agribusiness and this large scale meat production with sustainable farmers, right? Because the incredible tax subsidies, incentives, and all the ways that we taxpayers subsidize that business in order for them to sell the product cheaply, right? But the true cost is not being, we're not paying for the true cost of these products, right? Unlike what we might be paying for if we buy from a sustainable farmer, but not everybody can afford the higher price of meat that comes from a sustainable farm. And so I think we also need to look at that inequity in terms of the funding that is available for sustainable farming versus for agribusiness, and the enormous power that they hold with taxpayer money.
Thank you. This is an awesome segue to our next question, because we're starting to name kind of the crux of what we came together to discuss, which is sort of like, the sustainable and niche meat sector has been working very, very hard to create an alternative, right, to this system. And as you say, it's extremely hard to compete. And there's a lot of investment in naming the differences between industrial meat and sustainable meat. Yet we have illustrated, I believe, very well that it's all part of a system, right, that is very, very difficult and complex. And so I think one thing that I'm very interested in hearing from this group about is in light of COVID and after COVID, I think that the sustainable meat movement has really begun to grapple with these issues in a way that it hasn't before, kind of because COVID forced us to look at the ways in which regional food systems are set up to respond to system shocks like COVID, but also aren't, as Ryan noted, really there yet. And so I think there's obviously the understanding as a lot of names that that we can't ever totally compete necessarily with this massive consolidated industry. I do think we have to acknowledge that there's been a dissociation of these systemic problems within the sustainable meat movement, and an oversimplification of the solutions potentially, that allow folks with the privilege of choice to behave as though opting out is what we're doing, right? And that we're detaching essentially. And I think that there are some ways that COVID showed us that opting out or attempting to detach these regional food systems from the reality of the industrial paradigm is maybe contributing to some of our negative cycles. And so I would love to hear from the panelists about that issue of simplification, dissociation, challenging us to really to hold up a mirror to us essentially, in this moment.
Okay, well, I'll take the first stab. So, but I know, as I think early on when I was asked to participate in this, we had a brief conversation about the environmental community and the communities we work with and how we looked at sustainability and, in this alternative food system. And the issues that we have is that, um, the very people that's the most impacted can least afford to do anything different from what they're already doing. So it's like they're being forced to contribute to their own demise by the very economics of the system that they live in. And so many times, when we're in meetings and talking and somebody say something about the sustainable system, then the people in the community, we can't afford that high price food, and we know that already. So, it makes me wonder how, and it made me think back to a time period when I was in Philadelphia and we had these co-ops that existed, and the co-ops enabled everybody to be able to afford some good food because you would buy in bulk, and then we could purchase in bulk by the orders that people would place. Like if I place my order and everybody want a certain type of meat, then you could buy it in bulk, or you could maybe buy a whole animal and then you can divide it up like that. But everybody contributed, so it made it cheaper for everybody. And then you bring it back into the co-op and you distribute the food based on the orders that people place. But the workers in the co-op are the people that's also the recipients of the food. And so rather than having this form a co-op that became not cost effective, we were able to control the cost by having the workers be the very people that were placing the orders to come in and break the stuff down when it got there and help get it distributed. That way everybody could afford to be able to be a part of it. It wasn't like, well, I can't afford to be a part of this co-op because they asking for a membership fee that I don't have and stuff. So you be a worker, and then that gives you the right to be a part of the co-op. And so it makes me think, is that something that we could do within these communities to maybe help them access a healthier route to the foods that they want, rather than, be worried about, well, I can't get it because I can't afford it. And so therefore I'm forced to keep contributing to my own demise.
Right.
And I'm done.
Woo! 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 Ah! Oh man. Cool man. Can can I even follow after that? Oh, geez.
Yes, we all know you can.
All right,
That's
all
right.
right. All right, here we go. Here we go. I want to have some unpopular opinions, and yeah, it's just going to be the way it is. And I say this from a context of I train farmers not just in this country but overseas, where they do not have what we have, right? They raise things a little bit differently, and I work within their context. So I think in this conversation, just, as you were listening, think about context. Context is very, very important. All right, cool. Also, I'm not a legalist. There's that. All right. One thing that I like to tell farmers is that stop competing with Walmart. Stop competing with Smithfield. It's like going to the Olympics and trying to what's it called, the little ball where you, no, the discus, right, where you have the discus and you're throwing the disc, right, versus the javelin. Those are two different sports. You don't play a different sport and expect to win when they've had decades of massive vertical integration, billions of dollars put into a system that's already rigged for them to win. No point in playing in that. That's why I do believe that it's important to look outside the box when we think about what does it mean to market. One mistake a lot of farmers make is that they say, oh, well, my pigs, so my pork is better than Smithfield pork and stuff like that. Okay, stop comparing yourself to other people. Talk about what you do is good. You don't need to diminish anybody to bolster yourself up. Just talk about what you're doing good, right? So I think that's another thing that I would recommend for people who are producers is to really look at that aspect as well. I do think that in terms of local niche meat, it is a luxury item. I'm not at a point where I would dare say it's a necessity in terms of how we do things in the United States. Again, I go overseas, most folks are not eating meat every single day. Most folks aren't even eating meat every single week, right? Here in the United States, it's very common for people to eat some sorts of meat protein in every single meal, right? That's context. Me personally, and I'm only speaking for myself, I don't eat meat every single meal. I might eat meat in one meal out of the whole day, right? And the meat that I eat, 9 times out of 10, again, not a legalist, but 9 times out of 10, it's coming from a farmer that I already know, already trust, locally raised. And the meat that I'm getting from them, higher quality, more dense. I'm not having to fuel my body off of inferior products versus high quality products. If I'm eating high quality products, I don't need nearly as much. And again, I'm speaking for me and my body. Maybe you can relate to that, maybe you can't, that's totally cool. I do think that for niche producers, that there should be a giving back mentality, especially because meat is expensive. Being able to produce a cow, chicken, pig can be very expensive. But I still believe in that. And part of the issue with that is I get a lot of pushback on, well, Ryan, how are you telling us to give back a portion of our livestock production to the needy? Like, we're not making that much money. Okay, thank you for saying that. So now we're going to start talking about what it means to be financially stable, right? What it means to have farm business literacy. Part of the issue with excuses of why we don't give back, whether it's farmers, whether it's people in general, is that, oh, well, I got debt, or, oh, well, I don't make a lot of money. And, I'm not going to sit there and say, well, you should be ashamed of yourself for not being able to give back. What I've learned from my experience with farming and outside of farming and how I handle my money is that when I do make an effort to give back, even just a small portion of what I produce or a small portion of what I make, I get a return on that. It might not always be monetary return, but I do get some kind of return on that, even if it's just simply, you know what, I helped out humanity today. I wasn't trying to save humanity, I just helped them out. And if I could give someone who was in need of meat or was in need of money and be able to help them out, even just for a moment, then God bless them. I did the best that I can in that moment. I do believe in having partnerships. So I don't think that a farmer has to always do it out of their own pocket. So you can say, hey, I want to give back, but part of how you can finesse that a little bit is by being able to say, I would love to partner with this hospital, with these organizations and businesses, and let's throw a block party, right? Local communities. Let's do something that's more communal, right? Where even if I have to have some of that money or my costs pushed on through other organizations and businesses, that still allows me an opportunity to give something back to people who don't have the opportunity to get what I'm producing. Part of the issue with local meat production is that it's not easily accessible, right? And so people can't go to a grocery store. If which used to be me and my mom, my mom didn't have enough time to go to a farmer's market. If she did, she had to make time, which was a great expense to her when we were both starting out when I was younger. So that's something to keep in mind as producers, is that if we're going to make things accessible, we really need to understand that there are people that live in this country that to figure out how am I going to get to a farmer's market is a burden. It's an actual challenge because they might not have reliable transportation or even the means to be able to do that. Anyways, I'm jumping off my soapbox. I will chair myself and let Alana speak if she wants.
I think I'll just add a thought in terms of, of course, what we're dealing with are systemic issues, right, in our capitalist society, and all of our systems are interconnected. The environment, the air, the water, workers, and these meat processing and agribusiness in general facilities are, polluting our air, land, and water. They're exploitative of the workforce, and so if we're, I think part of what, and I'm certainly interested in sustainable farming as well. But we're together in this planet and in this country, or even in North Carolina, if we're going to reduce it, right, to our immediate community. And so we need to think about how to impact these systems that are, perpetuating the inequities, both in terms of workers as well as the inequities in what sustainable farmers can and cannot do and what support they get to do what they do, right? And for the long-term health of our planet and everybody else.
I think the power of what I'm hearing in all of your responses is how do we build into our mindset in such a way as to not repeat the status quo, right? As Naima was saying, grief and the duty of community repair is built into the Black community, right? And in capitalistic systems, it is not. It is ignored, right? How can we then, as a local food practitioner, say, how do we build in duty of repair? How do we build in community support? As Ryan is saying, how do we think of ourselves as business people who have it in our financial design to do charity, to do immediate need charity in addition to whatever justice advocacy we're doing? If it's in the design rather than being an afterthought, if we are willing to abandon the belief that as long as all the people who have the privilege of buying more exclusive food do, then it will then trickle down to the people who don't. As long as we realize that that's not actually working, and what's being established is an exclusive economic system that's available to those with privilege of choice, while all the human rights and social and environmental things continue because of a system of power, then how can we build this system and recognize the ways in which the system we're building might be borrowing from the system that we tried to subvert because it's cultural, because it's been culturally trained. That's the power that I'm hearing in your responses. And I see that Naima has unmuted herself, which means you have more wisdom to share with us.
Yeah, only because as you were speaking, I thought about, I said, okay, so I guess one way to look at this is, when we talk in the environmental arena, I teach these classes at the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill it's called Integrated Epidemiology and environmental justice. And one of the issues that we always address is this question of white privilege. It's like an unspoken ill that sits out there that nobody talks about, but it has a lot of burden on the very communities that I live in and work with. And so, as I was listening to you and thinking about this um, alternative meat system, it also made me think about capitalism as an unspoken ill that a system that's inherent in the very nature of everybody that live in this country, because this is what this country is founded on. And so without even thinking about it, we set up businesses and shops and do what we do, and without saying it, we looking to profit from it. But we may not acknowledge that we looking to profit, but that's what's happening because of the very nature of the system that we living in. So those two things came to mind, that capitalism is an unspoken condition, the same as white privilege, when we start talking about these injustices that exist, and how do we go about addressing them, and what are some of the things that could get in the way of us being able to sufficiently address them together. And so I just say, if we look at, if we think more about the systems that we set up, in this alternative meat system, are you really set up to not profit anything from the work that you're doing? And if you aren't, then maybe that's an avenue for opening the doors to help the people that can't afford to access this stuff. But if you set up to profit, then you're going to be buying into a system the same as the rest everybody else in this capitalist world, where I profit over people. And so it's something for us to really think about and talk about. And that's all. That was just a couple of thoughts that I had.
If I
Thank
can
you.
add on to that,
Yes, please do.
and I'll spend like 1 or 2 minutes. I know I talk a lot. You know, that's part of why I tell farmers, don't have this mentality of how do I extract wealth out of my customers. They won't say that, but that's how a lot of people act. Is how do I get their money into my pockets? Instead of thinking about how do I serve people powerfully. You serve people powerfully, people with money will appreciate you very well. But also it gets, at least for me, in the mindset of not everything that I do is going to be for profit or for money. There will be some type of loss of time or energy or even money in some cases. Still I got to run a sustainable business, right? But I do look at it from a standpoint of, I know that if I have a mindset of serving people, especially strategic, not just rich people or people that I know can afford me, but also people who I know they are not able to pay the kind of money that I would want them to pay me, right? But I know that if I have a heart to serve people, then I'm going to take those L's sometimes. But you rack up enough L's, you start making W's. And the people that, in my experience, that I take the time to mentor, educate, or serve, they are super excited about my vision and about my passion, because it's not about me anymore. It's about what I am doing to serve the people that I feel like I am called and blessed to serve. And that's a completely different perspective, mental shift versus how do I extract money out of my customers. That's one recommendation I think people in general should have, is how do I be of service to my fellow brother and sister that's sitting right beside me, whether they look like me or not. And if I'm doing that, the last thing we want to be thinking about is profitability. But when I express a need, like, hey, just letting y'all know, I'm running a business. Here are my prices. Here's why I'm flexible at. Here's why I'm not flexible at. If you're not able to meet that, that's totally fine. Sometimes it's like, I just can't do business with you. But other times it's not me being a legalist and saying, well, I will never do business with you. Because there are times where I'm like, you know what? Despite you not being where I would want you to be in price range, I'm still going to work with you because I love you and I care about you. And I want to see you succeed. I think that's what's important. I want people to be successful, whether they're farming or not. And that might mean there's a personal sacrifice on my end for that. But at the end, I get the benefit and the reward of seeing people doing what they love to do and being successful in that. And that comes all the way back to me one way or another. And I'm going to get off my soapbox again and let everyone else talk.
It's like a belief in the common good that we seem to be woefully lacking these days, right?
Yeah, built into it's in your strategic plan. I think I'm just keep going back to that, and I think, a lot of these are mindset encouragements. I mean, one of the participants had a very poignant remark about how this all relates to privilege of choice, whether the business owner, whether the person in the local, meat system has the ability to make some of these changes. But what comes up for me, I mean, on some of Ryan's earlier points about consumption, for example, it is dominant rhetoric in regenerative agriculture and holistic management that consumption does not need to change in order for us to do meat better. So here I am with my unpopular opinion, but like, let's think about that. Let's just think about that for a second with everything that we've heard today. If you're scrolling your Instagram, if you're scrolling your Facebook and you are seeing, I mean, this is something that I struggle with. It's the rhetoric of many respected leaders within regenerative ag and holistic management that consumption doesn't need to change. But I struggle with it because that seems like it's a rhetoric born out of defense about production capacity. That the sustainable agriculture sector feels the need to say, no, we really do have enough land and we really can produce enough animals and we really can feed everybody in a more sustainable way. And that's all fine and well, but defending production capacity by painting what an ideal situation might be seems to miss the realities of the here and now. So can we not acknowledge the possibilities and hopes of a regenerative future while also acknowledging that the regenerative movement doesn't have everything figured out across the supply chain? And when we take production challenges and scale challenges as just one piece of a big complex puzzle, I feel called to acknowledge that no examination of consumption right now by the people with the permission to be asking the question is a poor rhetoric. And so what I say to you as you scroll and as you like what the leaders are saying and as you share what the leaders are saying, to really ask yourself that question: how does my consumption drive a system of power and privilege that I am looking to subvert? And do I really want to just blindly adopt the rhetoric that is born out of a defense of production capacity? And that's just a mindset thing. It can be a very simple, just like taking a moment to stop and think about what's coming across the radio waves, the Facebook waves, and how it then impacts the way you tell the story, the way you help others, the way you communicate with your clients. The other piece is like who we put into power. If we're hearing from Ilana that we have populations of Latinx folks who are deeply impacted in certain counties in North Carolina, can we not put people who are more educated about their experience into positions of power with our votes? I don't, there's other ways besides just the ways we conduct business in the sustainable ag sector that we can start to collaborate and do that community participation. So I'm interested to know, as we round up, like, obviously we're not going to button this up for everybody. This is ongoing work, but I would like to hear, and you've hinted on it some, but what are some ways in which the people within this group, the Sustainable Meat Movement, can design more forward-thinking and holistic solutions or mindsets? Crickets.
Ooh,
Come on,
how
help
do
me
I
out.
answer this one? First of all, Meredith, preach, girl, preach, preach. All right, give me a second. I have a thought.
Yeah, no, this is totally a tough question. I think part of what comes up for me is that, again, it's all interconnected. We're all in this together, right? And so, and not isolating ourselves in our silos, especially as we think about the planet try to think about the planet and build a planet that's more sustainable for human and animal life and whoever else lives here. And I think, bringing back to the issue of immigrants, for example, for me, it's about bringing 11 million undocumented immigrants out of the shadows. And what the impact of that is that workers who are not working in the shadows have a fair chance to fight for their rights and for better pay and for safer working conditions. And what I'm getting at is, again, the equalizing of the cost of what things truly cost, right? Versus perpetuating a system that allows agribusiness to exploit a workforce and suppress the cost of their products because of that. And in terms of that, it's also about enacting a system that allows temporary workers to come in legally, so that there's an ebb and flow of labor force when labor is needed, they come up, or, you know, I mean, there's lots I can say about Latin American policy too, but we're not going to go there. It's about a living wage for everybody, right? And even universal minimal income to lift people out of poverty and to enable people to have more choices in their food systems as well. And it's about making room for the underrepresented to represent themselves, right? To have a voice in creating more just working conditions or more just planet. And not about being saved, but by having a seat at the table.
I think it's important to think about this. I mean, if we're obviously, like, we're imperfectly brainstorming here because this is a hard question, but I think it's what the question we want to leave folks with as we're rounding up, because I think we can all accept the fact that shocks such as COVID are only going to become more frequent, you know, and we don't know what's going to happen with COVID, but there is impending forced migration due to climate change. There is increasing frequency and intensity of disastrous weather. And so, you know, I don't, you know, the panelists are the spotlighted ones here, but I'm just going to take this moment to spotlight everybody in the room because it's a question that all of us need to consider. And I think, I don't know if Mary Beth is still with us, but we can also add in some questions from the audience if there have been any, because we are sort of running out of time. Obviously want to thank Naima and Ilana and Ryan so deeply and thoroughly for your time. I think I've had a question about education. How can I become an educator of others? And I think the answer to that is, you know, you know, there are many answers to that. But it was a question about how do I educate others about poultry processing. And there are many workshops. Maybe Ryan, you have some recommendations here.
Yeah, this depends on what kind of poultry process we're talking about. Are we talking about Mal-Air? Or are we talking about backyard poultry processing?
I think it's more like DIY poultry processing. Yeah.
Yeah, you can go to ncchoices.org. It's underneath CEFS, Center of Environmental Farming Systems, and they have plenty of information there. Also, talk to Ben Grimes. I think he's still on here. He has literally his own poultry processing business. I think the best way of being able to learn about that is by doing it and learning from people who do it well. Now, if you want to teach it, which is fun, it's always fun, because you can also make money out of it. Sorry, I'm a low-key capitalist. But you can also find ways of not just making money out of it, but engaging your community. So for some folks, they're like, oh, well, I'll charge $200 for a poultry class per person, per head. Now, anyone on a low income budget ain't gonna be able to afford that. They just ain't. They will have to save money. Now, if they really want to do it, they will have to save money to do it. But, you know, charging at a equitable rate, which is maybe at cost. So maybe not a retail price on, you know, training, but like at cost, might be more beneficial. So it might be $50, you know, that's a lot better than 200 for most people. And that allows for more people to come in and partake. You're going to see a lot of different colors when you do that. You're going to see a lot of different folks when you do that, instead of the same generic general people who would normally pay high dollar to go to a poultry processing workshop or something like that. Also, I think online, social media, YouTube, great opportunities to do that as well. But if you really want to build that community within your local community, or even within your region, definitely host an event. You can do that in partnership with folks like the North Carolina Extension, whether it's NC State Extension or North Carolina A&T Extension, and that depends on what county you're in. So go to your local county office and partner with them on a workshop. And they'll throw some money at it. They say, oh, you need promotions, we can promote it. Oh, you need this, they'll help you figure it out. They do event planning all the time. They can help you figure it out. So I think that'll be a really good ally if you're wanting to bring people onto the farm and educate and train them with some dollars back behind it. Usually, definitely check out your local extension office and see what they can do to partner with you. And hopefully that answered the question. If not, forgive me.
Okay. And I just will add to that, just thinking in terms of in what we do, North Carolina Environmental Justice Network, whenever we're having any kind of events or programs, we understand that the very people we want to attract are the ones that can least afford to be there. And so we make scholarships available that include their travel, their housing, their food, any materials that they would need, so that it take away all excuses about why I can't be there, and we usually, will rent vans for our organizers to bring as many people as they can fit into those vans that would like to be there. And it usually people show up because who doesn't like anything free when we tell the truth about it, so that's a way of helping to get people there that want to be but can't afford to be, is to make scholarships available that will offset the cost for that person. So that might be a way to think about it as well.
I think also like the assumptions of what people want to learn about or need to learn about are sometimes set forth by that structure. And one thing I'm working on myself is just like trying to get in my community without offering or asking for anything. Just show up where people are and listen to what they're talking about and what they need, and try to understand how that then informs what the farming community can do, or what the food service community can do, and sort of like trying to build the community before you create the structure that you want the community to fit into, I guess. So that's a thought that I had.
That'll keep you safe if you take that route. I love that, because as we've seen, there are a lot of people who start farms without even understanding who they're actually serving. And then they get into all kinds of debt, they graze all kinds of animals, put all kinds of infrastructure in, only to realize that they never actually understood who their clientele was. They just made assumptions the entire time. So being able to develop that community beforehand, beautiful. Well said. I like that. Anyways, I'm done.
Ilana, did you have a thought?
Not at this time. Just wondering if there are more questions.
There was a question I think that you might be able to speak to about how can folks know the chemicals that are being used at the meat processing plants. I'll have to look back and see if I can find exactly what the
I saw
question
that
was.
question scrolling through. Somebody named Mike.
Yeah, it says, is there any way to determine what chemicals each processor is using and how they are used apart from asking them directly?
Yeah, it's a good question. OSHA should have that information, Department of Labor. Not saying it's easy to get, but also I posted a link to an article on that was written this year, The Incalculable Cost of Cheap Chicken, that talks about some of the chemicals that these plants use, as well as which must be posted on their walls, right? That information needs to be available to the workers. If it is or it isn't, I don't know. but also talking about chemicals that have been long banned in Europe that we continue to use here. As somebody alluded earlier to the Lumber Ridge, well, we got a Lumber Ridge is in Lumberton County and Robeson County, sorry. And workers from Mount Air Farms there have reached out to us during COVID, but also recently because of a chemical that's making them sick. And they didn't know what to do about it, and it's making them really sick. And so, and the problem continues even after OSHA inspectors eventually went to inspect the plant after we helped the workers file a complaint. And so I know this is off topic, but you know, a topic here. So it's really, it's like in all things about these businesses, you know, the enormous protections that are given to corporations in America, and how hard it is to expose health and safety hazards and abuses of workers. And actually, the plant was so upset about the reporting done by this reporter, Tina Vasquez, on all the things that are happening in Lumber Ridge and all the other reporting she did through COVID about meat processing plants, that they're threatening to sue her for libel right now, actually, and have denied all charges as if the workers are all making this up. And what the workers have said to us is that the problem continues even after the OSHA inspection, that we don't even know the outcome of that. But that I imagine the inspectors let the company know that they're coming, and so they reduced the chemical levels the day that the inspectors were there, and then increased it the next day. And so there we go.
There you have it. And obviously, Ilana and her colleagues at the Hispanic Liaison, and Naima and her other fearless colleagues at the North Carolina Environmental Justice Network are doing this work on an ongoing basis. And Pork Rind is out in the world doing his work on an ongoing basis. So I encourage everybody here to look into these organizations and individuals and support their work in the ways that you can. Tell your friends, tell your customers about these issues. We do have to wrap up, unfortunately. And I don't know, Mary Beth, if you need to say anything. So I'll just sign off by saying how deeply grateful I am to Naima, Ilana, and Ryan. I'm so honored to have shared this space with you today.
Meredith, how can people reach the speakers?
Well,
I have their contact information in the app, and people can reach out as well as information on all of your organizations. And if you still need contact information, you can always reach out to CFSA and we'll put you in touch. But I just want to say thank you again to you all for sharing your time and your expertise and your energy with us. And I know this is the last session of this year's conference, but it is certainly not the last time that we will hear from you all. So I look forward to talking with you all again soon. Thank you.
Well, I would just like to say thanks to CFA for inviting me to participate, and I certainly am overjoyed to have been on the panel with Ilana and Pork Rind, and I look forward to us keeping a North Carolina connection going. You know, we have a lot in common, and I think that we can, you know, wind up partnering together to make this a better world and the world that we want to see. And so I look forward to being in touch with you all from this day forward. Thanks everybody that participated and listened in, and enjoy the rest of your day.
Dito, Naima.
Thanks so much.
Thank you, everybody who came. Appreciate it.
Same here. Thanks, y'all.
thanks.
Love you.